That's it for a quick teaser of what's in this video, and now I'll show you what I use against normal enemies, which also works on a test dummy. But before we dive into the specifics, let me welcome you to my updated guide for all PvE weapons based on the Jaws pistol. After over a month of gameplay and another 500 hours of experience, I've learned a lot. And even if you don't use the Jaws pistol, this guide has plenty for you. Here's what you'll find in this video. How to match your training dummy damage against real enemies. The best skin choices to craft your gear. How to boost Deviant damage up to 6 times for maximum potential. Pre-buffing tips to get the best performance out of your gear. Top mods for each gear slot, plus tips on mod conversion. My take on build-specific and resonance mods. Jaws build perfect for enemies immune to elemental damage. PvP Jaws build setup. The best choices for secondary weapons. Explanation of weapon range with recommended accessories. All sources to maximize crit rate. My Cradle choice for the Way of Winter scenario. How much PSI intensity impacts your DPS. Which Deviant is the best for pure damage. And that's not even everything. Watch until the end and you won't regret it. With over 1,000 hours in the game, I've packed all my experience into this guide, keeping it short, clear, and full of practical tips. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'm always here to answer any questions. My next big goal is reaching 1,000 subscribers, and I'd love for you to help build this community and be a part of it. Since this is still a new journey for me, every bit of your support keeps me going. Thanks for being here and making it all possible. Alright, now that you know what I used in most of the clips, let's do a quick recap of the weapons and key armor effects, which are essential for understanding a lot of mechanics in most weapon builds. Starting with weapons, the Jaws pistol triggers Unstable Bomber every 4 shots, and critical hits count as 2. This effect can also crit with an additional 25% crit rate, and its damage scales with PSI, crit damage, status, and elemental damage. Next up is our main secondary weapon, Recurve Crossbow. It inflicts bullseye after hitting a weak spot, increasing crit rate by 15% for 10 seconds. Bullseye also applies an 8% vulnerability debuff for 12 seconds, making enemies take extra damage from all sources. Lastly, our melee weapon, the Long Axe. Heavy attacks with this weapon grant Fortress Warfare, a 2-meter area of effect buff that provides heavy armor, which boosts weapon damage by 20%, and grants immunity to crowd control effects for 5 seconds. For every target hit with a heavy attack, it also increases our crit rate for all weapons by 8%, and melee swing speed by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. That's it for the weapons. Now, our key armor piece, the Shaman Vulture Top. This armor boosts our crit rate by 35% for 3 seconds after triggering Unstable Bomber. Now, let me show you my buffed and unbuffed stats before we proceed to damage tests. That wraps up the damage tests, but you might be wondering, what if my gear isn't fully maxed? What will my damage potential look like with lower PSI from my gear? Let's find out. As you can see, the damage difference from an extra 46 PSI intensity is around 4%, which isn't a huge deal. This means that even if your gear isn't fully enhanced, you can still reach around 350,000 to 400,000 DPS, depending on how good is your setup, which is still pretty impressive. I'll soon be uploading an updated guide on the blueprint conversion system to show how I managed to fully max out my gear already, so stay tuned. If you're still unfamiliar with the basics, check out my previous video on the topic. Now that we know my damage potential, let me show you a quick compilation of my damage progression. As you can see, my damage has improved massively since my last build guide. I remember the first time I hit 1 million total damage with one magazine, and that was a big moment. Now, I'm close to reaching 500,000 damage per second and 2 million per magazine, which is my next goal. But is 500,000 DPS even possible? That's my target, and I believe it's within reach with a few tweaks and some gear improvements I have in mind. So, subscribe and join me on this journey, and let's improve together. If you have any tips on what I could change, feel free to share them in the comments. Every suggestion is welcome. By the way, I'm playing on the EU Winter server. If you're there too and want to be my neighbor, I have a free slot near my tower. Just message me in-game. I'm mentioning my server because I know some might accuse me of posting content from an Asian or test server, but everything you see here is from the EU servers. Now let's go over how to reach high damage, not just against dummies, but also against all enemy types, including elites and bosses. The approach is simple. We need to focus on specific mod attributes and use Cradle buffs to reach max potential. As most of you know, the training dummy is treated as a normal enemy, which is why I stack as much damage as possible against it during testing. However, this stat doesn't help with elites and bosses, so instead, we need to focus on damage against great ones for bosses and bonus damage versus elites, which is straightforward. Mods let us reach up to 66% bonus damage against normal enemies, almost 40% against bosses, and just under 50% against elites. But how do we reach comparable damage bonuses for bosses and elites when these stats don't stack as high? The answer lies in Cradle buffs. With Cradles, you can add an extra 25% bonus damage against bosses and elites, which is especially useful after the recent update that revamped Deviants and allows them to stay with us longer. Unfortunately, they removed the additional 25% bonus damage against bosses from using a tactical item, which, in my opinion, makes the game feel a bit too easy. With every update, the game seems to simplify, and I worry that soon we won't need to rely on much strategy to one-shot enemies, but that's just my opinion. As some of you know, the Thermal Tower gives buffs like 30% weapon damage and 10% elemental damage. However, the damage boost isn't a game changer. It's more like a 5% damage compensation against the suppression damage reduction that dummies have, like when using the Jaws pistol. Also, since I'm in a heavily polluted zone, I missed out on the 10% weapon damage buff from the Bastille pants. So overall, it balances out. With the Cradle buff, when summoning a Deviant, we can reach almost 65% bonus damage against bosses and nearly 75% against elites, which is incredible. This means our boss damage can be close to what we do against a dummy, and against elites, we can potentially deal even more damage. However, showcasing this is tricky since elite enemies, even those in silos, tend to have lower health pools than bosses. Now that we know how this should work in theory, let's jump into real gameplay so I can show you how I do it. First, I'll go over the gear and Cradles I'll be using, while food and other buffs will stay the same as they were against the dummy. Unfortunately, I haven't had much time, and I was waiting for Pro Mode to unlock so I can really showcase my potential. For now, I only have footage from the Trent boss, which I took down with my pure weapon damage Jaws build that I'll be showing later in this video. As you'll see, it has a lot of potential, even though it's not fully optimized yet. Currently, I don't have much to upload for this build, so I'll give you a quick look at how I proved my point on the Memetic server. I plan to do the same in the way of winter scenario. Just like in Memetic, I'll be uploading full PvE content as I take on everything with my Jaws pistol build. If you're interested in seeing how it goes, feel free to follow along to catch the best tips and tricks for every challenge in the game. As you saw in the clips and on screen now, we're hitting bosses harder than the dummy, which I managed to do in the previous scenario. This shows that the damage you get on the dummy can translate to bosses and elites as long as your build is optimized. In the way of winter scenario, this should be achievable too, even though they removed the essential Cradle buff. Starting this Sunday, you can expect fresh daily uploads covering the new Pro Mode content. Now that I've showcased my build, let's dive into the key parts of this guide to help you fully understand and optimize every aspect of PvE gameplay. At the end, I'll also do a quick rundown of the PvP setup I use on my other character. Prepare to get loaded with pro tips that'll take your game to the next level. Starting with armor selection, there's not much room for change here since we're using 4 pieces of the Lone Wolf armor set, the Shaman Vulture top, and we've got 1 extra slot available. It's crucial to use legendary gear in this slot for a higher PSI boost than what epic grade gear provides. Next, it's all about picking the right armor set for that extra slot. We have a few options. Bastille, for a 10% weapon damage boost when your HP is above 70%. Renegade if you prefer a 15% increase in reload speed. Stormweaver to reduce stamina cost for rolling by 20%. Or Blackstone if you need cold or heat resistance, though I wouldn't recommend it. If you're struggling with survival, check out my quick guide on how to navigate the whole map after just 5 minutes of prep. Personally, I chose the Bastille set for that extra weapon damage boost. Lastly, in the armor section, we can optimize which armor calibration pieces to upgrade first. If you're mainly focused on boosting damage and PSI, upgrade your gear in an order that maximizes these stats. Start with the mask, then helmet, pants, gloves, top, and finally, boots. If PSI isn't relevant to your build or you're prioritizing HP, go in a different order. Begin with the top, then pants, boots, gloves, helmet, and finish with the mask. That wraps up armor selection. Alright, let's dive into picking our secondary weapons, your go-to support gear. We've got a few solid options here. Let's kick things off with my favorite, the Recurve Crossbow. This beast inflicts bullseye on weak spot hits and cranks up our crit rate by 15%. That crit boost is the key feature of this weapon. Sure, bullseye is a sweet addition, but there are many ways to trigger it, so it's not the main draw. Since the Jaws pistol build relies heavily on crit rate and crit damage, stacking as much crit rate as possible is essential, making the crossbow the top choice for maximum damage output. Next up is the AWS Bullseye, my second go-to support weapon, especially against enemies that lack easy weak spots. It works similarly to the crossbow, but what makes it appealing is its ease of use. Every bullet you fire after switching to this weapon will inflict bullseye, so it's practically brainless. It also boosts your weak spot damage, but that's not super relevant since Unstable Bomber can't hit weak spots, making that stat a bit pointless for us. Plus, you don't have to fuss over managing your magazine or arrows like with the crossbow, which is a nice quality of life improvement. I'd call this weapon a lazy choice though, with less damage increase compared to the crossbow. The next option for our build is the Compound Bow, which pairs nicely with the Jaws pistol since it also procs Unstable Bomber. The main reason to consider this as your secondary is its ability to boost your crit rate by a whopping 30% for 6 seconds, but you've got to secure a kill first. Ideally, you want to take out a boss or an elite ad in one shot to get that quick crit rate boost. I'd recommend using it only if you can trigger the bullseye effect from other sources. Lastly, we have the Wildfire Pistol. I see its use mainly in a weapon damage-focused Jaws pistol build, which I'll cover later in this video. However, even with that setup, I still think the recurve crossbow outperforms it in total DPS gain. There's one boss fight, the Forsaken Giant, where it might shine better than the others, but honestly, you don't need that much damage for him since each of his phases is DPS limited. That's it for ranged weapons. For melee, we've got one solid option, the Long Axe. Every 10 seconds, a heavy attack activates Fortress Warfare, giving us an 8% crit rate per target hit, stacking up to 3 times. The main reason to use this weapon is to trigger Fortress Warfare, so we can get an easy damage boost from Cradles. Other melee weapons, like the Frozen Northern Pike or the Torch, are mainly for speedruns or open-world exploration, since you can animation cancel easily with them, and they help you survive in cold or hot environments. That covers our secondary weapon choices. Now let's briefly talk about calibrations, accessories, and how the range stat affects your damage. For calibrations, we've got 3 choices, each with its own benefits. First off, always aim to use a legendary calibration with double crit rate bonuses. No matter your build, it's essential. Starting with the most common choice, Rapid Shot Style. It's perfect for status-focused Jaws pistol builds, adding significant fire rate and magazine capacity. The minor drawback of negative 15% attack is a small trade-off considering what it offers. However, if you don't drop it yourself, finding one for sale might be tough due to its popularity. Next, we have Precision Style, an underrated choice for pure weapon Jaws builds. This calibration provides a strong attack boost and extra range, amplifying mid to long range damage. While the lower fire rate stings, the increased bullet power more than compensates for max weapon damage Jaws builds. Stick around as I'll dive deeper into this later in the video. Finally, Portable Style is great for speedruns and open-world activities, boosting mobility with no drawbacks. Now, let's cover accessories. Before that, here's a quick breakdown of each attribute. Accuracy affects how precisely your shots land where aimed. Stability reduces recoil, and mobility impacts action speed, like aiming and firing while moving. Range can be misleading, especially when it comes to understanding how damage drop-off works in the game. Minimum damage multiplier represents the distance at which your damage begins to fall off. For the Jaws pistol, this means you'll start seeing reduced damage at around 17 meters. From there, damage continues to decrease until it reaches the maximum damage drop-off, which for the Jaws is about 35 meters. Beyond this range, damage won't decrease further, as the game caps damage drop-off at 50%. To see how your range changes with calibrations or mods, check your battle stats, as the range stat doesn't update in the Accessories tab. So what's the ideal accessory setup? Based on my testing, accuracy should be your top priority. Everything else, like recoil or range, can be adjusted through technique or playstyle. If your accuracy is only around 50, you'll miss a lot of shots from mid-range, even with perfect aim. I usually max out accuracy with some added stability for smoother recoil control. As for range, ignore it unless you're running a pure weapon damage build, though precision-style calibration might be plenty on its own. On ammo, with maxed gear and high PSI, blasting pistol ammo is ideal but hard to sustain, so you'll mostly rely on tungsten AP ammo. Precision ammo also offers a significant damage boost for weapon builds and is easy to craft. The best part about ammo now is the flexibility. Thanks to a recent quality of life update, you can easily switch to tungsten for trash mobs and save legendary ammo for bosses. Now that we've covered calibrations, accessories, and ammo, let's move on to the new mechanics from the Way of Winter scenario, animal skins, which enhance gear effects. I'll go over the best skin choices and, as we go, I'll guide you through the top farming route to gather all the skins mentioned in this guide. Stick around to get the most efficient path for farming these essential materials. Starting with the helmet, you'll want a defensive boost. I haven't tested if the damage reduction stat works in PvE, or if NPCs can hit weak spots, so if you know, drop a comment. Assuming it works, my top picks are wool, rock wool, and golden wool, with golden wool being the best due to its higher boost. For the top and pants, you have 3 solid options. For heat resistance, go with Coastal Bay Crocodile skin, and for cold resistance, Floating Ice Bear skin. If you're set on resistances, choose Westland Wolf skin, which I prefer for the bonus move speed and stamina. It's really useful. Gloves are about preference. You can increase either gathering speed or yield. I go with Legendary Crocodile skin for extra logging and mining yield on the final hit. For shoes, choose a skin that boosts mobility. I prefer non-conditional Westland Wolf skin for a flat 6% movement speed boost. Alternatively, consider Grassland Wolf skin, Forest Deer hide, or Floating Ice Bear skin if you're in a cold zone, though they're conditional. Or if mobility isn't your focus, Mountain Cowhide grants an extra 15 stamina. Finally, for the mask, go for DPS boost skins. Lucky Rabbit Fur increases elemental damage by 10% after a crit, which is easy to trigger. But Golden Wool is arguably better, giving a 12% boost that alternates between weapon and status damage. The only downside is that this rapid switching might cause lag, but that's just my speculation. For a weapon damage build, the options are limited. Golden Wool's random 1% to 12% boost to weapon damage, or Westland Wolfskin's 6% weak spot bonus is okay. If you have any recommendations, drop them below. Keep in mind, though, that this is a slow process. From my experience farming hundreds of skins, legendary and epic skins have about a 4% drop rate. The toughest one to get is likely Golden Wool, as it has 2 epics in its pool alongside legendary option. I only managed to farm 6 Golden Wool skins out of around 900 wools. Now that you know the best skin options, let's move on to Cradle optimization. In this scenario, the developers have revamped nearly all Cradles, making many more viable for different builds. Right now, I'm using 2 different Cradle sets, one for PvE, focused on bosses and elites, and another set for open-world activities like resource farming. I'll quickly show both sets without further explanation, as they're pretty self-explanatory. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments section. After optimizing your Cradle, the next big topic is mod optimization, covering the best mod choices for each gear piece, attribute effect priorities with my tier list, and my thoughts on talents versus violent mods. I'll also briefly share opinions on specific build mods like the Unstable Bomber mod for weapons and resonance mods for gloves and pants. Let's start with primary weapon mods. There are 3 options here. First, we have Heavy Explosives. While mainly a PvP choice for most, this mod staggers all normal enemies and many elites. If you're struggling to survive or just enjoy staggering enemies, it's a solid choice. Second, the Bombardier Souvenir mod works best when your magazine has at least 20 bullets. With fewer than 20, it refills only 1 bullet instead of 2. The third option is a favorite among players for its high burst damage, but it loses efficiency in prolonged fights due to reload times compared to Bombardier Souvenir. My recommendation is to use Reckless Bomber for 90% of the game and switch to other options in specific scenarios. For secondary weapons, equip the Vulnerability Amplifier mod on the Recurve crossbow. For melee weapons like the Long Axe, pick any mod that works for you, as mods only work when using the weapon. Personally, I use Portable Territory. Now onto helmet mods. The first is Momentum Up, which I don't recommend unless you're tackling specific content like Forsaken Monolith. This mod performs better against enemies immune to elemental damage and is ideal for pure weapon damage Jaws build. The next two options are more versatile in DPS. Fateful Strike is effective when enemies lack weak spots, or if hitting weak spots consistently is difficult. Use this mod if your crit rate is below 70% with the Shaman Vulture effect. It's worth noting that with Fateful Strike, you won't benefit from Steady Hand Cradle, which boosts weak spot damage. The final option is Deviation Expert. If enemies have easy-to-hit weak spots and you have a 75% plus crit rate, go for this one. It does reduce your range, meaning less damage on targets at mid to long range. However, it compensates by boosting your fire rate and status damage. From my tests, this mod outperforms Fateful Strike when you hit weak spots over 80% of the time at close range, especially with pre-buffing. For mask mods, there are two main choices. The first is Targeted Strike, a situational mod if you need extra crit rate. This mod pairs well with weapon damage-focused Jaws build, though it weakens unstable bomber damage compared to the alternative. The second choice is Pinpoint Strike, which works consistently and doesn't rely on marked enemies, making it a reliable and easier-to-use option. For the top mod, go with Blue Mod Crit Damage Enhancement. If you're unsure how to farm blue mods on the Manibus server, check my guide. For Way of Winter players, I'll be releasing a guide soon, so stay tuned. Moving to pants, Deadshot is the best and only real option. For gloves, there are two mods to consider: Crit Boost, which significantly increases crit rate, and Crit Amplifier, which boosts both crit damage and crit rate. I prefer the Crit Amplifier. For shoes, the best mod choice is Covered Advance. Now that we've covered mods, let's address Violent versus Talents. In most cases with 7 Violent mods, around 55% of total damage comes from Unstable Bomber. In my tests, switching from Violent to Talents didn't change my total damage, but it did shift the balance of damage between Unstable Bomber and normal bullet hits. Your preference might depend on the deviations you use. Violent mods are better if you lean towards Canine Skull, while Talents work better with Shattered Maiden. My recommendation: use the mod with better attribute effects against the enemy type you're facing. Personally, I use mostly Violent mods since they have better attribute effects, and status damage can be hit or miss, as some enemies are immune to it. So it often makes sense to have more Violent than Talents mods. Moving to attribute effects and priorities, focusing on PvE means you'll want a damage bonus to enemies on each mod. I will make a tier list assuming we are fighting bosses. The ideal mod would include crit damage, damage against great ones, and weapon damage, with priority on the damage bonus over weapon damage, as the damage bonus boosts unstable bomber damage, while weapon damage only affects normal bullet hits. A situational fourth priority is magazine capacity if you're using Bombardier Souvenir to raise the magazine cap to 20. If magazine capacity isn't a concern, then damage to normal enemies is next, since bosses and elites often spawn common enemies. After that, reload speed or HP bonuses are good additions. If you have a Talents mod with elemental damage, status damage, and a damage bonus to enemies, consider using it over Violent mods. I don't recommend using a Talents mod with only an elemental damage boost without a status damage boost over Violent mods. Now let's dive into mods for specific builds, like the Unstable Bomber Weapon mod or Resonance mods for gloves and pants. Starting with build-specific weapon mods, these can be farmed from Prime Wars in the Manibus scenario, or Chaos Weavers in Way of Winter. These mods are often better than Violent or Talents mods if you're lucky with attribute effects, though they're harder to farm compared to regular mods from bosses or silos. After about 200 controllers, I gave up on farming these due to lackluster drops. As for Resonance mods, they're solid, but require specific content farming, like high-risk events and thermal tower purification. I'd recommend using a Resonance mod with double crit damage stacking, as they can give up to a 40% crit damage boost when fully stacked. However, avoid Resonance mods with elemental damage stacking, as they max out at 8% elemental damage, equal to Talents mods, which provide a constant 8% boost without requiring stacks. Now that we know which mods to use, let's talk about how to optimize the mod conversion system to improve our chances of getting the best possible mods. First off, to be able to convert to a specific mod, you'll need to have dropped that exact mod at least 3 times, which unlocks the conversion option. Once it's unlocked, you'll move on to suffix selection, where you can choose which suffix type you want. I don't recommend using the autofill option or selecting a random suffix option. These can waste up to 6 mods, and you might even lose some valuable ones if you're not careful. My advice is to lock any high-quality mods you don't want to risk losing, so they're safely excluded from the selection. Choose mods for the conversion process wisely. For example, if your build focuses mainly on status damage, use mods with suffixes you don't need in the 2 extra slots, like precision suffix mods. And as a general tip, start with mods you wouldn't use in any build. For instance, something like Secluded Strike. To show how it works, let's go through an example with a Talents mod. This same process applies to all types. After selecting Talents, you'll see that the 4 blank slots indicate that each must contain a Talents mod to guarantee a Talents result after conversion. I recommend only using mods with a purple attribute and at least 1 additional blue attribute here. Lower quality mods will reduce your chances of getting guaranteed green attributes. Quick tier list for conversion results, from worst to best. The worst case is a guaranteed common, followed by at most 1 normal, then minimum rarity common. The best result you can get is a guaranteed rare with the rest being green attributes, and sometimes even 2 blues. Using 6 mods with 6 purple and blue attributes will give you a minimum rarity common, a solid starting point. If you use lower quality mods for conversion, the results will get worse. To guarantee blue attributes with the rest being green, aim for a total of 6 purple, 8 blue, and 3 green attributes across all mods used. Going any lower in quality won't yield good results. That wraps up everything on mods. If you have any questions or want to share your thoughts, feel free to drop a comment. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more high-quality guides and tutorials. Stick around to catch all the key steps to boost your gameplay. Let's briefly talk about the best food buffs that increase damage and a few food-related tips to boost your effects even more. Starting with the hydration buff, we have only one solid choice, the whimsical drink, which increases status damage significantly, leaving no room for alternatives. For energy buffs, there are a few options. The Stargazy Pie boosts crit damage and is the most flexible, working all the time when your energy is full. It's less conditional and increases damage against all enemy types, though slightly weaker than the hot dog. Next, we have the Mixed Fried Hot Dog, which offers the highest damage boost against enemies marked with the Bullseye debuff. It's great for party play if you don't mind switching to a support weapon to mark targets, or if you have the Memetic specialization to let scout drones mark for you. Another option is Crumbly Bread, which doesn't boost unstable bomber damage but is the top choice for fights against elemental immune enemies or if you're running a weapon-focused Jaws build. Finally, we have a new option from the Way of Winter scenario, Popcorn, which increases unstable bomber damage by 10%. While this buff is weaker than the others, it's worth noting as a new addition to the game. Another food worth mentioning is Ginger Drop, which doesn't directly boost damage but extends Fortress Warfare by 5 seconds. This can lead to a permanent Fortress Warfare buff with the axe, maintaining a 100% uptime as long as you stay in the circle. For the meat buff, Pan-Fried Barracuda Fish provides an extra 5% PSI intensity, and it's easy to catch using mince bait in any sea location. If your gear isn't as enhanced, you might prefer Pan-Fried Sea Bass for a 10% fire rate increase, though finding a reliable fishing spot for it has been tricky. If you do, please share it. Now for some cooking tips. First, find someone who can build an enhanced kitchen set with 2 bonus effects to boost your food buffs and reduce spoilage. Also, always use your Chefosaurus Rex with the highest skill rating, managing his mood by taking him out of the isolated securement unit when you're not cooking to avoid mood and power depletion. In terms of memetic specializations, if you're making canned food, the canned goods specialization increases yield by +1. For whimsical drink, Iced Treat is excellent, increasing buff duration by 200%, and effect by 30%. Stardust Dish is also handy, providing 2 special Whim effects and HP recovery when sanity is full for 30 minutes. Lastly, keep a portable fridge to reduce food spoilage in your inventory by 90%. That wraps up food buffs and tips. Now, let's move on to the best deviations to consider, and, most importantly, how to boost their damage output for higher overall DPS potential. Right now, we have 2 solid DPS boosting deviants. First is the Canine Skull, which auto-attacks increases weapon damage taken by enemies up to 43% and draws aggro. When an enemy dies near it, it spawns a clone that despawns after a single hit. This used to be my top choice, but with recent AI fixes, Shattered Maiden is now the best pick for this build. Shattered Maiden also auto-attacks, slows and freezes non-boss enemies in front with strong AoE, and increases final explosion damage taken by up to 80%. Now, onto 2 other deviants that won't boost DPS directly but improve gameplay. First, Mini Wonder. This deviant absorbs bullets in a radius and auto-reloads your magazine from reserves. Great against ranged enemies and cuts out reloading time, which could mean more DPS in prolonged fights. Finally, Festering Gel, an essential early-game deviant. It creates a shelter on summon, blocks attacks, and restores 12% HP and 5.9% sanity per second to allies nearby, helping you save activators and heal sanity. Alright, let me show you how to boost your deviant damage by up to 6 times, which will massively impact your overall damage output. No one else is talking about this, so it might be something new for you. As you could see, increasing deviant damage requires focusing on several elements. For weapons with mixed damage, like the Jaws pistol, consider going for status mods instead of violent mods to boost your deviant DPS as well. The same approach applies to food buffs. If your build doesn't rely on any essential drink buff, try using the whimsical drink to increase deviant damage, even if you're running something like Shrapnel Valor. Using Cradles that enhance status effects also makes sense, even if your build doesn't focus on status damage. Plus, the Deviation Master Cradle becomes essential since it boosts deviant damage against bosses and elites. Applying vulnerability to enemies will amplify deviant damage even further. Grabbing Golden Wool as an ingredient for your mask gives you a random boost to status damage of up to 12%. Lastly, mutations in monoliths and silos can also help increase your deviant DPS. As you can see, there are plenty of ways to boost not only your damage but your deviant damage too. If you have any further tips, let me know in the comments, and if I helped you, please put a like on my video. It always makes me happy and feels like someone appreciates my work. That's it for deviants. Now let me show you how I built my Jaws pistol, focusing purely on weapon damage instead of unstable bomber or mixed damage. I'll go over the gear I used for damage tests and against the Trent. Cradles, food buffs, and gear remain the same. For this build, you'll want to use the Canine Skull instead of the Shattered Maiden, as it boosts weapon damage, which is more important in this setup. For calibration, we really only have one choice, which is Precision style with double crit rate. For accessories, you'll want to focus on boosting range and accuracy, as stability isn't a big deal here since your fire rate won't be as fast as with the classic Jaws build. When it comes to ammo, you will want to use tungsten and legendary precision pistol ammo. With the recent update, you can easily switch ammunition mid-fight, so you can go with tungsten for regular enemies and switch to higher quality ammo for bosses. So, that's it for this build variation. Let's start by saying that this is a solo PvP build. If you're aiming for group PvP, you'll want to tweak a few things like mods, skins, or cradles to better suit team play. Now, onto armor selection. Currently, there's no better PvP armor set than using 4 pieces of the Savior set for any build. We'll add 1 piece from the Heavy Duty set to boost max HP, though you could swap this with the Shelterer set for status damage reduction and slightly better stats, as it's legendary instead of epic. For the key armor piece, we're using the Shaman Vulture top. This piece is essential in any Jaws build variation because we're focused on maximizing crit rate to trigger Unstable Bomber more frequently. Moving to mods, starting with the weapon, Heavy Explosives is the go-to for staggering enemies. On the helmet, Fateful Strike will max out crit rate. On the mask, Pinpoint Strike will increase Unstable Bomber damage. For the top, Resist Advantage is effective against snipers. Or you could go with Critical Rescue, which synergizes well with the 4-piece Savior set. Since there isn't an ideal PvP option for pants, we'll go with Life Force Boost to raise max HP. For gloves, choose Crit Amplifier to boost crit rate and crit damage, or Crit Boost for extra crit rate. Finally, Covered Advance is the best option for boots. For attribute effects on mods, aim for Violent or Talents mods with 2 defensive stats, like max HP, weapon damage reduction, status damage reduction, or head damage reduction. With mods set, let's move on to skins. For crafting gear, use Golden Wool for the helmet. For pants and top, either Wasteland Wolf skin for mobility or Coastal Bay Crocodile for status damage reduction. For gloves, any skin will do, while for boots, pick a skin that matches your playstyle, as most options offer some mobility. Lastly, for the mask, use Golden Wool again. Now let's talk about the Jaws pistol setup. Use the Rapid Shot style calibration with double crit rate. For accessories, prioritize ones that improve accuracy and stability, making it easier to hit your target. Range won't be a major factor with this build, as you'll be playing mid to close range. For ammo, go with Tungsten AP, or the best available option. Next, let's look at Cradles and my recommendations. Moving on to food buffs. For drink buff, go with Whimsical Drink as always for status damage increase. For food buff, Safety Sandwich is ideal for damage reduction from other players. And for a meat buff, choose Pristine Bear Meat for max HP or Pan-Fried Sea Bass for fire rate if you can find a good fishing spot for it. If you know where to fish for sea bass, let me know in the comments. It's worth mentioning that you'll want to stay in the middleweight category to get that easy 10% torso damage reduction. Lastly, let's talk about Deviants. I prefer Mini Wonder for its bullet absorption, which can be a game changer. Alternatively, you could use Festering Gel or Voodoo Doll. That wraps up the PvP optimization. Now, let's quickly go over all the crit rate sources so you can maximize your potential with this build. Starting with the base weapon crit rate. For the Jaws pistol, it's set at 6%. Unstable Bomber has an additional 25% crit rate thanks to its weapon feature. From Calibration, we can add up to 16%. The Lone Wolf 2-piece set bonus adds another 5% crit rate. Depending on which glove mod you choose, you can get either 10% or 15%. Use Crit Boost if you're missing an ideal calibration. The Armor's Blue mod, Crit Damage Enhancement, provides an extra 2% crit rate, and helmet mods like Fateful Strike and First Move Advantage add an additional 10% crit rate. If your crit rate is still lower than 70% with the Shaman Vulture top effect, which grants 35% crit rate for 3 seconds after triggering Unstable Bomber, consider using these mods to boost it further. At this point, you should be sitting around 80 to 84% crit rate, depending on your calibration, or even 85 to 89% if you're using the Crit Boost mod. This is a solid range because, with the crossbow's added 15% crit rate against marked targets, you'll reach close to 100%. Now, let's look at some temporary crit rate buffs. First, reloading gives you an extra 8% crit rate for 2 seconds through the Lone Wolf 4-piece set bonus, which is great since it covers half your magazine with added crit. The crossbow itself adds 15% crit rate against marked targets, giving you an edge when aiming for crit hits. Using a heavy attack with the long axe melee weapon can add up to 24% crit rate for 10 seconds. While this can be tricky to trigger, it's definitely worth mentioning. If you still need more crit rate, you can use the Targeted Strike Mask mod, which gives an extra 10% crit rate when hitting marked enemies. That's a rundown of crit rate sources. If I missed anything, let me know in the comments. Now let's go over some useful memetic specializations that will make your PvE gameplay smoother. First up, my top pick, the Invisible Hunter specialization for drones. With this, your drones gain the bull's eye effect, become reusable, and receive a boost to both HP and damage. The best part? These drones now mark enemies automatically, so you don't need to worry about applying it yourself. A huge quality of life improvement. Because of this, you can now use Cradles, mods, and food that work specifically against marked enemies. In the Way of Winter scenario, we have a new memetic specialization, the Freezing Drone. This upgrade enables your drones to slow down nearby enemies, giving you even easier time dodging enemies. Now let's look at the next essential memetic, Barrage of Bullets for portable MG turrets. With this specialization, your turrets can trigger the bounce effect, are reusable, and gain a 30% boost in both HP and damage. The best thing here is the reusability, which is another big quality of life improvement, and these turrets often pull aggro away from you, making fights smoother. And in the new scenario, there is also an additional turret specialization, Explosive Automatic Ammo, which gives MG turret bullets a chance to trigger the Unstable Bomber effect, further increasing their damage output. These memetic specializations are always my go-to, especially since, unlike facilities, they're not something someone else can just set up for you once and be done with. If you have any favorite memetics for the Way of Winter scenario, drop them in the comments. A quick word on the blueprint conversion system. If you want to maximize your blueprint fragment gain and learn how to do it efficiently, check out my guide on it, which I uploaded a while back. I'll also be releasing an updated guide soon with more advanced tips on upgrading and swapping enhancement levels across different gear. So subscribe and stay tuned. Now let's go over some of the best whims to help you in different situations. First up is the Weaver. When you roll near hostile enemies, this whim leaves a spiderweb on the ground that chains and slows any nearby foes, making it great for any situation where you need to kite or avoid large group of enemies. Next, my favorite whim, the Transformation Cookie. This one lets you transform into a nearby random object. The transformation only ends if you perform an action other than jumping, making it an excellent choice for speedruns, as it allows you to completely bypass enemies and speed up your farming process. Finally, there's Living Armor, which activates when your HP drops below 20%. It restores 100% of your health and sanity within 5 seconds. This whim is invaluable in tough situations, helping you survive those critical moments. Now for some extra tips. First, always keep an eye on mutations in hard or pro mode, monoliths, and silos. Some mutations can boost your damage by over 30%, so make sure to take advantage of these whenever possible. And a tip for Way of Winter scenario. Inside silos and monoliths, temperature management isn't as crucial as it is in the open world. So, consider using gear with skins that boost mobility rather than focusing on cold or heat resistance. That's it for my tips. If you've got any great insights, share them in the comments. Now we're down to the final topic for this guide, how to pre-buff with maximum efficiency for big damage numbers. This isn't just for showing off against the dummy, it works across all content in the game. First, we need to use a preset optimized with the best damage boost against the enemy type we're fighting. For anyone focused on PvE, I recommend having 3 separate presets. One for normal enemies, one for elites, and one for bosses. We'll need the recurve crossbow and the long axe, as these weapons provide the biggest damage boosts. It's also important to use Cradles, as they'll further enhance our damage when we use these weapons. Now, to start our pre-buff, wait for Covered Advance to reapply so you have enough time to get the full effect with all buffs on. Once that's ready, begin by stacking Lone Shadow, a buff from the Lone Wolf armor set. When the stacks are maxed, switch to the crossbow, aim for a headshot to apply the bullseye effect, then quickly swap to the long axe. As the axe animation ends, switch to your primary weapon and reload to trigger an additional boost from the Cradles. Meanwhile, summon your Deviant. Ideally, it'll start attacking the target just as your reload finishes, allowing all buffs to align. Let me show you how this looks in action against boss fight. It's also worth mentioning that we can no longer animation cancel the long axe for maximum buffs. Now, if you cancel the animation right away, you won't receive any bonuses. However, if Fortress Warfare isn't your priority, you can still cancel the animation midway to get the crit rate buff, which is still useful. Since full animation canceling on the long axe is no longer an option, it's best to pre-buff close to enemies in real scenarios. This way, in addition to Fortress Warfare, you'll gain a substantial crit rate boost. That's it for this guide. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end of this long video. Your support means a lot, whether it's subscribing, liking the videos, or just being here. It's what keeps this channel going. If you have any questions, tips to share, or just want to share your thoughts, drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my channel for more Once Human content, from PvE guides to gameplay tips. And be sure to hit that notification bell to stay up to date, because I've got more content coming that you won't want to miss. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.